All right.
Is being recorded.
Okay. Hello, everybody. We're back with our weekly chat with author Kevin McAleer. We've had sessions on Ernest Hemingway. We had quite a few sessions on Jack London. Last week was F. Scott Fitzgerald, a survey of all of their lives and works, some of their major works, I should say, and including some of the minor works. I mean, we did about 40 short stories of Jack London. At any rate, we're now going to talk about one of Kevin's favorite authors, Raymond Chandler. He has quite a bit to say about him. I don't know if this is going to be one session or we're going to need two or even three. We'll let Kevin decide that as we go through this. But Kevin, tell us what you like so much about Raymond Chandler, just for starters.
I like the fact that he's writing about our hometown, Los Angeles. I also like the fact that he wrote in a period and he places the action of his stories and novels in the 30s and 40s, which is a favorite period of mine as well, if only by virtue of the films that Hollywood was making at that time. There's also a familial connection because our father grew up in Hollywood, born 1928, in the 30s and 40s, his formative years. So there's always a sort of, I feel like a real kinship in the sense of the word to this whole milieu that Chandler seizes upon, then remakes in the image of the great Philip Marlowe.
Okay, that's good. Now, let me ask you this. Do you consider him to be a great writer? Like
Yes,
like
yes.
on the same level as a Hemingway, Fitzgerald, or Jack London? Is he
Mhm.
on that level?
Yes. In
Okay.
fact, he's my favorite author, and not because of the Los Angeles connection. It's because of his writing, and we'll get into that.
Okay.
But let the viewers judge for themselves after they've watched this. They've heard my spiel on Chandler, and if they haven't read him, they can go to his books and they can judge for themselves if he's great or not. We just don't have to say he's great, he's great, he's great. Well, don't believe us. Listen to what I have to say,
Well,
and then
you say don't
decide
believe.
for yourself whether you want to maybe take a chance on him.
Now you say don't believe us, but I'm not sure if I consider him a great writer on the level that we're talking about, Hemingway, Fitzgerald. I'm not sure. I've read some of his stuff. I can't say I'm as enthusiastic as you are, but I'm willing to listen and learn from you
Okay.
what his main points are. Okay, so how do you want to do this? Do you want to explore some of his great novels one by one, or do you just want to do some of the short stories or talk about the life? How would you like to?
No, exploring the novels one by one would be an impossible task. For one thing, because Chandler's plots are so convoluted. That has several reasons. One is that he himself said that he wasn't a great plotter. And the other reason is that in his first four, I believe, at least in his first four novels, these were composites of short stories he'd already written and published. In Black Mask and Dime Detective, the two primary publications in the 30s, where he was also apprenticing as a writer. He started writing when he was 43. So this is a great object lesson for those of you who think it's too late to
Wow.
start writing. It's never too late. And he published his first novel, The Big Sleep, in 1939 at the age of 50. So, take heart. And I do. I began writing fiction relatively late. And I thought, well, boy, if this guy can start putting pen to paper at that late age, then why can't I? So you don't want to go through each novel each of the seven, because there's not that much to talk about. It would take 15, 20 minutes for each novel to unravel the plot. And even at the end, you're not even sure if you followed it. There's a famous story when they were filming The Big Sleep, which I'm certain you've seen and I think you like, correct?
I don't know that I've seen that, and I don't know
Oh, you
that.
don't know? Okay, well, you must see that. That's Bogart in his debut role as Philip Marlowe, 1946. Bacall's in it too. And Howard Hawks is the director. And I think maybe even William Faulkner wrote the screenplay. I could be wrong on that, but anyway, Hawks was sitting down together, I think maybe with Faulkner, maybe not, but at least with Bogart, and they were talking about the plot, and they were asking themselves certain questions, and there's this one part of the movie where the chauffeur, doesn't matter, but this certain chauffeur drives off the end of a pier into the Pacific Ocean. And whether it's suicide, whether it's a murder, it's unclear. Well, Bogart, let's say Bogart, and Hawks, they couldn't figure out. They went back to the novel and they read it and they said, who killed this guy? Was it a suicide? We haven't cleared this up. And they sent a telegram. I think at that point, Chandler was living in La Jolla. He'd moved there recently. They sent a telegram to Chandler and asked him, hey, so who killed this chauffeur? And Chandler wrote back, hell if I know. He didn't know where all the pieces in his puzzle actually connected. He got so confused. And this was his first novel. So let's put that one to rest. We're not going to go through each individual novel, but we've already started talking about Chandler. And maybe you can just continue on from here.
I guess I did see The Big Sleep. It was long ago, and I do remember some of the difficulties in following the plot. And also,
that's chronic to a Chandler novel, by the way. But you don't read it for the plot. He is one of those authors where the solution of the crime is not the point. If you tore out the last page of the novel and you didn't get the solution, it wouldn't matter. You'd be maybe a little bit disappointed you don't get the last page, but maybe you'd be mostly disappointed that you don't get one more page of this sublime Chandler-esque prose. It's about the writing. It's about the style of prose. And you may have a question on that count.
Well, my question is, if he's not known for clear, easy plots to remember, but it's more convoluted and it's more about the journey than where you arrive, would you say that you like him mostly because he's a great stylist? Is that the word we use? Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
He's a great stylist, and he gives us a great voice, that of Philip Marlowe.
Okay.
I would argue as great a literary invention as Sherlock Holmes, Auguste Dupin, Hercule Poirot. Greater because he's, I'm partial here.
Yeah, he's from your hometown.
Yeah. But the voices, well, not that. We'll forget Los Angeles for the time being. It really is about the prose. He could have been writing about New York, a city I detest. And not only, by the way, did Jack London not much care for New York, but nor did Chandler. Why am I getting in jabs at New York? I don't know, but anyway, he could have written about any city, and I still would have loved his prose. And that is to be equated with the voice of Philip Marlowe in his 7 novels. He writes in the first person. And the voice is one that it's a combination of romantic idealism and this very mordant, sardonic humor, which I'm partial to.
We have
along with great, snappy, wisecracking dialogue, to which I'm also very partial, and with great, trenchant, an eye for the telling detail, descriptions of colorful characters, and mostly very bleak places. So it's this combination of poetry and humor that I most value in Chandler's prose, and which he brought to this genre. That was his contribution. I mentioned a couple already. Think of Poe. There's no humor in Poe with Murders in the Rue Morgue or The Purloined Letter. Poe has to be mentioned, although he only wrote 2 or 3 detective novels, actually 2, because he essentially invented the form. Right? We have to acknowledge that.
Yes.
So tip of the hat to Edgar Allan. And then we'll jump ahead to Sherlock Holmes, and there's not much humor in that either, right? There's not much poetry either. And I'll give a few passages here. You can judge for yourself if my designation of Chandler's prose as poetic meets your criteria. It may not. But anyway, I don't think anyone could argue that Poe or Arthur Conan Doyle brought poetry or humor.
And you also mentioned
their stories.
Hercule Poirot of Agatha Christie also is not a.
It's about the solving of the mystery. It's about ratiocination. It's about deductive reasoning, and that is something that Chandler. He wrote a whole essay on it in 1944, published in The Atlantic, called The Simple Art of Murder, where he makes the case that this sort of detective story, written by the likes of Doyle, Poe, and Christie, and one of your favorites, Dorothy Sayers, Lord Peter Wimsey.
Correct.
He thinks, and I would say right off the bat, that he liked certain things about Miss Sayers. Okay, he thought she could really write. She had certain virtues, but what he didn't like is this, the esoteric knowledge, this very arcane fund of facts and figures that one had to have to solve a mystery, right? And he's got a great line. He talks about Dashiell Hammett in this essay, The Simple Art of Murder, and I have it here so I don't misquote it. Because he gives Hammett all the credit in the world. Dashiell Hammett, the inventor of the crime novel, a la American, with Sam Spade, Maltese Falcon, the most famous novel, and another protagonist he employs in his novels and other places, the Continental Op, right? Doesn't even have a name, right? He's just this blank figure.
Okay.
But as you may or may not know, Hammett himself had worked for the Pinkertons. He had been a detective.
Okay.
So he knew whereof he spoke. And when he started writing in the early 20s, what he did, and what Chandler argues for in this essay, is that Hammett, here we go, Hammett took murder out of the Venetian vase. He's using the Venetian vase as a symbol for all this hoity-toity, Mr. Green, committing the murder in the lounge with a candlestick, that kind of stuff, Hammett took murder out of the Venetian vase and dropped it into the alley. Hammett gave murder back to the kind of people that commit it for reasons, not just to provide a corpse. In other words, not just to provide a story to, fool around with and then wow the reader at the end. Okay.
Right.
So we get Mr. Dashiell Hammett in there, but again, not even Hammett brought that humor and poetry to his prose this is my thesis, that I argue Chandler did to a genre that was only interested, particularly when he and Hammett were writing in the 20s and 30s, and particularly for this one certain magazine called Black Mask. It was at its height under a fellow named Cap, short for captain. He was a captain in the Army in World War I, Cap Shaw. Now, what Cap Shaw always wanted, he wanted action, because he was kind of a man of action too, and manly man type. So that's what he wanted, action, action, action. And in fact, I have another thing on hand, just perchance. Chandler writes about that. He said when he was writing for Black Mask in the 30s, apprenticing as a writer, learning how to write these things, he said that he would put into a story a line like this, and I quote, "He got out of the car and walked across the sun-drenched sidewalk until the shadow of the awning over the entrance fell across his face like the touch of cool water." And they took that out when they published the story, something like that. So they didn't want that. They would have preferred something like he got out of the car and walked across the sidewalk until the shadow of the awning or something. Anyway, I don't know, but that's the point, being that the slightest bit of atmospheric prose just slowed up the action. You didn't want that. Our readers want to turn the page. They want, bop, bam, boosh, action, and that won't wash. But when he published his first novel, The Big Sleep, he did quite a bit of that. And in fact, I'm sort of taking the ball and running with it, but one thought is connecting with the next. The Big Sleep ends on a very elegiac note. And a lot of his novels end that way too. And this is one of my favorite. It's a very famous one for those who know Chandler or this kind of fiction. And it explains also what the title means, The Big Sleep, in case there's any doubt. So we're at the very end of the novel. What did it matter? Excuse me. Start again. What did it matter where you lay once you were dead? In a dirty sump or in a marble tower on top of a high hill? You were dead. You were sleeping the big sleep. You were not bothered by things like that. Oil and water were the same as wind and air to you. You just slept the big sleep, not caring about the nastiness of how you died or where you fell. Me, I was part of the nastiness now. Far more a part of it than Rusty Reagan was. But the old man didn't have to be. He could lie quiet in his canopied bed with his bloodless hands folded on the sheet, waiting. His heart was a brief, uncertain murmur. His thoughts were gray as ashes. And in a little while, he too, like Rusty Reagan, would be sleeping the big sleep. That would have never gotten into the pulps. But he was able to then cut loose in his novels and insert that kind of thing. You have never found that in a Dashiell Hammett short story. That kind of elevated prose.
So this is the kind of thing that Cap Shaw would not have wanted in his.
No way.
Wait,
because you read these short stories that have been published in the meantime, some of the things he cobbled together to get his later novels. It's interesting to kind of do detective work in that regard and see, oh gosh, I read this in The Lady in the Lake. Yeah, we got a lady in a lake. Must be from, that. And I just want to say one thing. Keep your thought. What Chandler will often do, however, is he will try to take the sting off that elegiac sentiment with, in this case, a little 3-line coda to end the novel. So we have, and in a little while, he too, like Rusty Reagan, will be sleeping the big sleep. On the way downtown, I stopped at a bar and had a couple of double scotches. They didn't do me any good. All they did was make me think of Silverwig, and I never saw her again. Silverwig was a woman that he had a little flirtation with. So, your question.
I think I forgot. Oh, okay, here it is. So if that's not the kind of writing that Cap Shaw wanted the writers to give him, when did Raymond Chandler find his own voice where he could put in the more poetic, unique style that he had? When did he start coming into his fore with that?
Well, you get little tastes of it. I'll get a pile of books here if I wanted to quote things, because I find that me talking about it for an hour, it doesn't do much for the listener unless they get a little taste of what
I
this
think
guy's
we
all
want
about.
a lot of samples. Yeah.
Don't you think? I mean,
Yeah.
let's see.
That's what we're here for.
Whether you think or not, I'm going to lay it on you.
Yeah.
And for example, one story that he wrote, I think this came much later. It was almost contemporaneous with when he started to publish his novels, but he would sneak things into his stories. The humor was more acceptable to a fellow like Cap Shaw at Black Mask than was the kind of elevated, sentimental stuff. But here's a nice one. Here's where we get what Chandler is also very good at. Not that Hammett wasn't good at it. We'll just keep Hammett as his opposite number of comparison, because they are usually considered the two greats, the two who established the genre. Put James M. Cain aside, because he wasn't writing detective novels. He was writing something else. Not that it wasn't hard-boiled crime fiction. It certainly was, but we'll keep him aside for now. But here's how he opens a story called Red Wind. There was a desert wind blowing that night. It was one of those hot, dry Santa Anas that come down through the mountain passes and curl your hair and make your nerves jump and your skin itch. On nights like that, every booze party ends in a fight. Meek little wives feel the edge of the carving knife and study their husbands' necks. Anything can happen. You can even get a full glass of beer at a cocktail lounge. Okay, so again, the little humorous wisecrack at the end. So, okay, don't take me too seriously here. He was always doing that. So, I mean, again, the opening paragraph of that in a short story, I think this was a later short story. I don't even think it was published in Black Mask. I forget. But yes, he was trying to sneak these things in, as he talks about in that one example, walking under the awning. So he'd been doing that for quite a while. And then toward the end of his career, he was doing it to the extent that, for example, I noted these things going through my old books. I even noted these things, like years back when I first read them. They're all in tatters now. But this is an example of how he was even just like stopping the action to throw in a wisecrack. For example, this is from his sixth novel, The Long Goodbye, the sixth of seven, and his last great novel, The Long Goodbye. And you don't need to know the story, but Philip Marlowe is standing outside a bar called Victor's, and then something happens that has very little to do with the story. And the fellow who is his name's Big Willie Magoon, he puts in an appearance for half a page, and then we never see him again, right? For the next half of the book. He's just thrown in there, I think, so Chandler can get a wisecrack off, and you'll hear it at the end. So let me read it, get another taste of the guy's style. The door of a car banged open, and a man about 7 feet high and 4 feet wide jumped out of it, took one look at Agostino, then one long stride, and grabbed him by the throat with one hand. How many times I gotta tell you cheap hoods not to hang around where I eat, he roared. He shook Agostino and hurled him across the sidewalk against the wall. Chick crumpled up, coughing. Chick Agostino. Next time, the enormous man yelled, I sure as hell put the blast on you, and believe me, boy, you'll be holding a gun when they pick you up. Chick shook his head and said nothing. The big man gave me a raking glance and grinned. Nice night, he said, and strolled into Victor's. I watched Chick straighten himself out and regain some of his composure. Who's your buddy? I asked him. Big Willie Magoon, he said thickly, a vice squad bimbo. He thinks he's tough. I said, you mean he isn't sure? I mean, we never meet this Big Willie Magoon. Chick Agostino fades. Chick Agostino plays a very minor role briefly in the novel. But Chandler's just trying to get off a wisecrack, you see? So that's what I like that, little digression to get some humor in there, make you laugh. We got plenty of pages, 350 about in this novel to get on with the story, right? But that wouldn't have passed muster in Black Mask in the 30s. So Chandler is pulling out all the stops toward the end. And here's another example of something relatedly. He was not only getting in all the jokes, but he was also holding up his own genre, the crime novel, to ridicule in sort of an affectionate way. Here's a little passage. This is The Lady in the Lake. This is his fourth novel, written in 1943, I believe, published. And he's face to face with some woman, and she pulls a gun on him, okay? Now she's speaking. It's Philip Marlowe, of course, face to face with her. You wondered why I gave you the empty gun. She had given him an empty gun. Why not? I had another one in my bag, like this. Her right hand came up from her coat pocket and she pointed it at me, so she's got a gun in it. I grinned. It may not have been the heartiest grin in the world, but it was a grin. I've never liked this scene, I said. Detective confronts murderer. Murderer produces gun, points same at detective. Murderer tells detective the whole sad story with the idea of shooting him at the end of it, thus wasting a lot of valuable time, even if in the end, murderer did shoot detective. Only murderer never does. Only murderer never does. Something always happens to prevent it. The gods don't like this scene either. They always manage to spoil it. But this time, she said softly and got up and moved towards me softly across the carpet. Suppose we make it a little different. Suppose I don't tell you anything and nothing happens and I do shoot you. I still wouldn't like the scene, I said. Now that's vintage Chandler. So in his fourth novel, he's making fun of the whole genre, right?
He's parodying.
Yeah, pardon me?
He's parodying the genre. It's a parody.
He's burlesquing it, yes. And having fun doing it, and we're having fun bearing witness to it.
That's right. Now, there's a quote from Robert B. Parker I picked up from this is what I read recently, Trouble is My Business.
That's good.
and it also has in here Finger Man, Goldfish, and Red Wind. Those are the things I've read to prepare.
Red Wind is the one I read the first paragraph from, so yeah.
Yeah, Red Wind. Yeah, Goldfish was probably my favorite. And it was somewhat easy to follow. Someone stole a pearl necklace and he's looking for it. It wasn't too convoluted for it.
Right.
But I do have a quote from Robert B. Parker when I went to the bookstore looking for some Chandler this week, they had a book with a quote on the opening front matter from Robert B. Parker. Let me read it to you here. It says,
Mhm.
Chandler seems to have created the culminating American hero, wised up, hopeful, thoughtful, adventurous, sentimental, cynical, and rebellious. That's Robert B. Parker's assessment of why Chandler is what he calls the culminating American hero. Do you agree with that assessment there? The culminating American hero?
Well, he is definitely an American hero because he uses all the slang. Uh, Chandler's dialogue is full of slang, and he plays around with it. You know, he fashions it in his own way to give it a little twist, so it's not just hackneyed. You know, you're repeating something that people just said back then. And he's vulgar, you know, as a man of his time and place would have been,
Yeah.
and in his certain business, he's tough-minded. But yeah, there is this certain residue of sentiment, and he's a man of honor. I don't know if Parker used that word honor,
No, I don't think he did.
but that's a big word in the makeup of Philip Marlowe, and that was very important to Chandler, that there be a certain idealism in the story among all this filth and corruption and sexual obsession. There's usually a femme fatale and a murder at the center of these stories, and
You know,
all of this seedy, lurid, sordid, choose your adjective universe. There has to be a leavening quality to elevate it, which is why he didn't like James M. Cain, by the way. Although he worked on his book to make arguably the first film noir ever, Double Indemnity, with Billy Wilder, as we know, 1944. That's why he didn't care for James M. Cain. I'm a great fan of Cain's, but Chandler didn't like him because he said there's no redeeming qualities to the characters. There's no redeeming elements. It's just the slow slide to degradation. And with Philip Marlowe, you bring this certain honorable quality to bear. And he, in fact, writes about that in The Simple Art of Murder again. It's very short, but it's a famous, famous passage. And he says, in everything that can be called art, there is a quality of redemption. It may be pure tragedy, if it is high tragedy, and it may be pity and irony, and it may be the raucous laughter of the strong man. But down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. The detective in this kind of story must be such a man. He is the hero. He is everything. And Chandler got this sense of honor and this code of honor, which he transposed into the figure of Philip Marlowe. It has been argued that he got it from his public school education in England. He went to Dulwich College. He was an American. He was born in Chicago, Illinois, to an Irish immigrant mother and an American father of Irish Quaker heritage. So he's Irish, of Irish extraction. At a certain point, his mother divorced the father. At the age of 7, I believe, she took Raymond, her only child, back to Ireland. She was originally from Waterford. It's in the southeast of Ireland, Waterford. Briefly, I suppose, but then on to London, to a suburb of London, where he grew up from the age of 7 to about 18 or 19. And nearby to where he lived was Dulwich College, Dulwich, okay, a public school along the lines of Eton and rugby, I suppose, things of that sort. And he was very much impacted by his years at Dulwich College, where he was a scholar of Greek and Roman, and he got an excellent education, a British education. And also this public school sense of honor, which was still a going concern in the pre-war years, Chandler having been born in 1888. You also see that in his prose, incidentally, I have to say. He has, in his narrative prose, it's a very formal prose, relatively speaking. He will use American terms, American slang even, in his narration, right? The non-dialogue parts. But it's a very British sentence structure. It's not as amorphous as then when you get into the dialogue, which is all over the map, right? In terms of the expressions and the colloquialisms. So you have this sort of divided style, which is very compelling in the hands of a master like Chandler, right? I don't do that, for example, in my own stuff. I'm colloquial throughout. As I'm speaking now, I basically, people are gonna think, oh my goodness. I basically speak in my prose works. I don't get lofty and elevated, nor does Chandler, far be it, but there's a more formal quality that hits as soon as, let's stick with the novels, as soon as Marlowe starts to narrate, right? So the voice changes from his dialogue voice a little bit.
Oh, I see.
It's interesting. It's interesting. And what's also interesting, this first person narrator, which you don't have at Hammett, he doesn't give Spade a first person narrative voice, for example, in the Maltese Falcon. I do believe, I think it's a third person telling. But that's what the film noir took on board. The narrator telling the story, right? The voiceover. That's Chandler. And it's the Chandler-esque voice. And we get that in arguably the first film noir ever, Double Indemnity. Again, Chandler and Billy Wilder, the director, collaborated on the screenplay. Chandler did most of the dialogue, it appears, by Billy Wilder's account. Billy Wilder gave him the Hollywood structure you need to make a viable film. He'd never done that before. But Chandler, the movie opens with Fred McMurray driving to his customer and talking about it. You know, I had a job out in Pasadena. I drove up there. It was a sunny day. You know, this kind of thing. You get that voice, and you're in it. You know, that very intimate voice, and yeah, that's a contribution perhaps to the whole film noir genre. I don't know.
But Kev, actually, just a slight correction. The film opens at the end, where you see the car drive up to the detective agency, and then McMurray, that character, confesses the whole thing, and then it opens. Yeah.
Of course, you're right. Yes, of course, you're right.
Just a little minor correction there. Okay, so so what else is there to say about Chandler? Let me give you a couple more quotes of what others had to say about him.
There are reams of things to be said about Chandler, but you have to ask the questions to.
Okay, so I want to read this quote. I found a lot of compelling quotes on the front matter of these books, and I wanted to just share at least a few of them. I shared the one from Robert B. Parker. Here's one from Joyce Carol. And you know what? I like reading quotes from other accomplished writers because they should know what they're talking about. So Joyce Carol Oates, she says in the New York Times Review of Books, she says the following. Speaking of Chandler, the prose rises to heights of unself-conscious eloquence, and we realize with a jolt of excitement that we are in the presence of not a mere action tale teller, but a stylist, a writer with a vision. Unquote. So,
yes,
a vision. What was his vision? What you mentioned him as a stylist. But what was his vision of the world he lived in, of the people he dealt with in these novels?
Well, he brought a double vision to it because he was an American, but he'd been brought up and educated in England. So, and he didn't come to Los Angeles until about 1913. So he was in his mid-20s at that point. And so he grew up a little bit, and he grew up in Nebraska, basically, I should say, before his mother took him out to back home. So he has, again, this double vision. He could see America from the inside out because he was an American, but he can see it from the outside in too. And particularly this city of Los Angeles, which was a phenomenally new thing with Hollywood at its core, the film industry, or it would later, at least in the 20s and 30s, become its glamorous core, let us say. There are so many aspects to Los Angeles. But he brought this eye for the grotesque, seeing these things as a foreigner, actually, but not a foreigner, not having to learn the language, not having to learn the lingo. And that gave him a great eye for the telling detail, which is a hallmark of great writers. They don't bore you to death with long page-long descriptions of things, but they give you the telling detail, the telling observation. So that's what his vision was, if I've answered it at all. But let me give you an example. And this is from my favorite novel of his. This is from Farewell, My Lovely, his second novel. And he just brought it all together here. I think this is most Chandler aficionado's favorite.
Okay.
As much as I can gather. And you know something. This isn't going to be it. I'm glad we'll get back to that in a moment. Sorry, okay. I got a little bit of myself. This is from The High Window. This is his third novel. And okay. This is a description, and again, the eye for the telling detail, right? This is a description of Bunker Hill. We all know Bunker Hill. Angelinos used to have the Angels flight.
Yep.
The little funicular going up there.
Right in the heart of downtown.
Right, and I won't read the whole description, but I'll just cut to the chase here. The important sections. Bunker Hill is old town, lost town, shabby town, crook town. Out of the apartment houses come women who should be young but have faces like stale beer. Men with pulled down hats and quick eyes that look the street over behind the cupped hand that shields the match flame. Worn intellectuals with cigarette coughs and no money in the bank. Fly cops with granite faces and unwavering eyes. Cokies and coke peddlers. People who look like nothing in particular and know it. And once in a while, even men that actually go to work, but they come out early when the wide cracked sidewalks are empty and still have dew on them. I couldn't write something like that, even if I had the talent, because I'd lived in Los Angeles too long. I remember as a kid, we'd go out to our grandma's in Hollywood, where our father grew up. And I wasn't noticing anything. It was just San Diego Freeway, get off at, or Hollywood Freeway, get off at Highland, Hollywood Bowl there, Hollywood High School,
Go to Willoughby.
Actors on the left.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Then you go to Willoughby and turn on Orange left on.
Right. But you weren't noticing things, right? You'd seen them too often. You'd been exposed to them for too long. Well, Chandler, he had not grown up with this world. Okay, again, American, a master of the vernacular, but he was coming to LA, and for the first time in 1913. And as the city changed, and it changed very rapidly, his eye for the grotesque, his jaundiced eye, as it were, became even sharper, because in the interwar years, Los Angeles was a very corrupt town. I don't know how many of our viewers know this, but it was extraordinarily corrupt. You had a mayor, what was his name? Mayor Frank Shaw in the 30s. In 1938, just to give you an idea, he was the first mayor of a major American city to be recalled. Okay, I don't have to go into this, all right?
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. What?
His police chief was a fellow by the name of Two Gun Davis. I don't even have to go into details. Two Gun Davis. I mean, the LAPD doesn't have its reputation for brutality for nothing. It goes back a ways, all right? And the DAs in that period were also very suspect. You had a fellow, gets back to my area of interest, a fellow by the name of Buron Fitz from 1928 to 1940, and he was in tight with the Hollywood studios. And whenever one of their stars got into trouble for whatever reason, drunk driving, runs a guy over, he would get him off, right? The investigation would be discontinued at the same time as he gets a little payola from behind from the studio boss. This kind of thing. He was voted out of office, by the way, a small detail, in 1940, and the new DA was a fellow by the name of Honest John Dockweiler. Yes, Honest John. He was the guy who railroaded Errol Flynn in the double rape, statutory rape case of 1942. He wanted to get back at the Hollywood studio system. Flynn was a very, very convenient target because Flynn was always getting into trouble in one form or another. He was getting back at them because they hadn't funded his campaign against Mr. Buron Fitz. The Hollywood studios had funded
Oh, all right.
Buron Fitz, and not Dockweiler. So Dockweiler said, "Okay, you guys, next star or producer, director, screenwriter, but preferably a star because more high profile, gets out of line, he's going down." And he almost took poor Errol Flynn down, right? This is the kind of city that Chandler was observing with this double vision, with this jaundiced eye, this great eye for the telling detail, and reporting on. So he's not only a great, great writer just in terms of prose. Miss Oates agrees with me, Mr. Parker agrees with me, but he's a great social historian, right?
Interesting.
And because he, for example, one example, back to my favorite novel, what is it? Farewell, My Lovely. Which I think is one of the great titles, Farewell, My Lovely. They didn't like it at first at Knopf. He was publishing his first novels at Knopf. They didn't like it because it's like, they think, what is this? Some sort of historical romance? People are going to think this isn't some crime novel. In fact, they didn't like the title even for the film version of it. It became Murder My Sweet. Okay, also not a bad title. But anyway, Farewell, My Lovely. In that novel, there is a boat out beyond the 3-mile limit in Santa Monica Bay where gambling is permitted. Okay, and they take these water boats out to these speedboats, take people from the Santa Monica Pier out to these boats, and the novel basically ends with a confrontation with the gangster who runs the casino on the boat and everything else. But this was a fact. You had these boats out beyond the 3-mile limit in Santa Monica Bay. You had these, not just one, you had about a half dozen as far as I understand, and they didn't get shut down until 1946. This is the kind of city LA was, and this is the kind of city that Chandler was observing, and he was just, he was taking at face value for his own stuff, okay? And another aspect of Philip Marlowe, which is very relevant to this whole idea of Chandler being a great social historian, is that being in Los Angeles, you got to have a car to get around. So he's very mobile. He's going to all parts of town, not only Bunker Hill, but Santa Monica, which Chandler calls Bay City, For those of you out there who don't know, Santa Monica is its own separate city. It has its own mayor and its own police force. I always say I'm from Los Angeles, born in Los Angeles, but actually I was born in Santa Monica at St. John's Hospital. So I'm not actually a born Angelino, bred, having grown up in the San Fernando Valley, but a small technical detail. He's getting around. He's going up to Big Bear. He's going to all parts of the city. And by virtue of his trade, private detective, he's coming into contact with all classes of people. So in a horizontal sense and in a vertical sense, he's seeing this Los Angeles society firsthand and reporting on it. So it's a very convenient figure, this private detective in his car, driving around, interviewing people, strong-arming people, beating up thugs, and whatever he has to do to solve the case. It gives us a beautiful cross-section of the society in Los Angeles in the 30s and 40s.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of him as a social historian, but you make some good points there.
It's evident if you know anything about the period. You read it, you read these novels, and you're drawing all sorts of real-life comparisons in your mind as you read.
I was thinking while you were saying that, do you think Los Angeles is an actual character in his novels? It becomes a character in its own right?
Oh, yes. I mean, I can hardly even imagine Los Angeles in the 30s and 40s without my Chandler filter.
And another question.
I'm beyond hope. I can't be saved. He has created my Los Angeles of those decades. He really has. And he has created the Los Angeles of those decades as Conan Doyle created London of the 1890s and early 20th century with Sherlock Holmes.
There you go.
Or someone like Woody Allen with his films, who has created New York. For even someone who doesn't care for it, I get my vision of New York, which is a loving vision, an affectionate vision on Woody's part, via his films.
Especially,
I mean, if you have a literary bent, you can read Balzac, and he gives you Paris of the first half of the 19th century, and that's your Paris. Even if you go to Paris, in the year 2024, there's going to always be a little bit of that Balzacian Paris there. So even when I'm in Los Angeles, which isn't often,
not anymore.
In the modern era, I still see things through Chandler's eyes a little bit.
What about James M. Cain? You mentioned him, that he wrote Double Indemnity, and this was the first film noir with Chandler doing the script. Was James M. Cain and Chandler, did they ever intermingle or admire each other? Or what? Another more broad-based question is, what did the other contemporaries of Chandler think of him? Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and the aforementioned James M. Cain. Was he admired by his contemporaries, or was he kind of in his own little world there in a corner of the detective novel?
Well, get Cain out of the way. As I said earlier, he didn't care for Cain's stuff, right? He didn't think it had any.
His stuff.
I don't know. Probably. I think Cain was not prejudicial against Chandler just because Chandler didn't like his stuff. I don't know if it got out that he knew that Chandler was.
And did Dashiell Hammett like Chandler's stuff?
I think so. Dashiell Hammett was a Black Mask writer. They only met once, as far as I understand it, through Chandler's letters, which, by the way, are gems of intimate, revealing prose. You should read Chandler's letters. They're out there in a bound copy that I have.
Now,
It's not funny. We've gone through it so often that it's loose leaf.
Did Hemingway admire Chandler? Because you did mention in an earlier talk that Hemingway wrote The Killers, which is kind of a similar thing to what Chandler would be doing.
I don't know if he read him. I really don't. But Chandler admired Hemingway.
Okay.
And those were the two authors he admired most and were perhaps his greatest influence. I don't know if there were two authors he admired most. Let me take that back. But he gives all the credit for the hard-boiled style of prose writing to Hemingway and Hammett. And even in this essay he wrote for The Atlantic in 1944, he talks about how he has a question in his mind whether it was Hammett who was influenced by Hemingway or the other way around. Because Hammett was publishing in Black Mask and other periodicals, Smart Set, Mencken, in 1922. And lots of stuff in 1923, 24. Hemingway only came out with his first published work, which was, I think, 23 sometime, a very slim volume called 3 Stories and 10 Poems, or 10 Poems and 3 Stories, I don't know which. But his first even very unsubstantial work was sometime in 1923. And Hammett had been publishing all sorts of stories, dozens of stories ever since 1922. It's hard to imagine that Hemingway had not come across Hammett at some point and said, wow, this is some prose. Not to say that Hammett should be, given credit for Ernest Hemingway, but Chandler raised the question himself in this essay, The Simple Art of Murder.
Okay, Kevin, we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. Any final thoughts on Chandler before we go?
Let me give you a few of his.
What is Chandler's legacy?
No, let's leave off with the legacy bit for now. Maybe we'll have another part on him, if you don't mind, because I was about to launch. Huh?
I don't mind.
Okay. I was about to launch into a short little observation that Chandler is famous for his similes. That's something we haven't talked about yet. His outlandish similes. And the most famous is, I know it by heart. It opens, "Farewell, my lovely." There's this gigantic ex-con, and he's dressed to the nines in all kinds of outrageous apparel. And Central Avenue, which was a black district of Los Angeles back then. And he says something like, Central Avenue isn't the quietest dressed street in the world, but this fellow, in his getup, he looked about as inconspicuous as a tarantula on a slice of angel food. That's a very famous simile, but it's an apt one. It shows you this creative mind, this crazed mind. Another one I got right here is, I wanted to mention, also from Farewell, My Lovely. He talks about a beautiful blonde. He says, "She was a blonde to make a bishop kick a hole in a stained glass window." That's just hilarious, right? That kind of stuff. He talks about when he has to vomit at a certain point. This is all Philip Marlowe, his voice. And he says, "Dizzy Dean never threw anything harder." Okay, Dizzy Dean, famous pitcher at that time.
Yeah.
It goes on and on. He's just very funny. And I'll end with this. And again, it's Farewell, My Lovely, my favorite novel. And I'll give you a little sampling of one of his techniques. Now I'll set it up here by just reading a couple lines. And Marlowe was driving out to this very wealthy mansion, not quite seaside, but on the other side of Pacific Coast Highway. It was, excuse me. It was close to the ocean, and you could feel the ocean in the air, but you couldn't see water from the front of the place. Astor Drive had a long, smooth curve there, and the houses on the inland side were just nice houses. But on the canyon side, they were great silent estates with 12-foot walls and wrought iron gates and ornamental hedges. And inside, if you could get inside, a special brand of sunshine, very quiet, put up in noise-proof containers just for the upper classes. That's very Chandler. But now we get, so he gets into the estate. He makes it in past the guard. And this is classic Chandler. The house itself was not so much. It was smaller than Buckingham Palace, rather gray for California, and probably had fewer windows than the Chrysler Building. Obviously a massive place, okay, right? This is an interesting technique. I looked it up recently because we were going to have this talk. I looked it up because he does it all the time. It's this use of a negative statement in order to emphasize a positive meaning, okay, right? The house itself was not so much. It was smaller than Buckingham Palace, rather gray for California, and probably had fewer windows than the Chrysler Building. He does this all the time. It's a technique. And the technique has a name. It's called litotes, okay? How's that for our viewing audience, yeah? Litotes, you learn something, if nothing else, what litotes is. So you exaggerate in a negative way to put a positive spin on something.
All right, very interesting. Now, I don't know, do you want to continue the discussion on Chandler next week?
We could talk about his life, which is very interesting, as we did like with Jack London, because we haven't gotten into his life at all, except for the Dulwich part and a little bit about writing for the
okay,
movie.
maybe we'll do that. I'll be in touch with you about what we're going to do exactly next week. But anyway, Kev, this was a wonderful opening hour on Chandler. A lot of interesting points you've made. So that's about all. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
See you later. Bye.